It's also a great pleasure for me to be here with Representative Branch. We've known each other for a long time. Let me just say a couple of things and then you'll get a more formal introduction. The first is we're all interested in the future of our state and the future of education, the future of higher education. And we could not have a better chairman of the House Higher Education Committee who is guiding us through and providing leadership in challenging, but I think very important times when we're going to set the blueprint for what higher education is in the state for a long time to come. And so you're going to be hearing from somebody who is at the helm in terms of where higher education is going, and we are thankful, Mr. Chairman, that you are at the helm. And the other thing, I get to work in the Capitol quite a bit. I work with Chairman Branch on a number of issues in higher education, and you'll be hearing today from somebody who is a master at bringing consensus together. That, after all, is what politics is about. We have different views, different ways of going about things, and it's bringing a consensus together so that political views actually get turned into improvements in the state. And so you, as I said, going to be hearing from a master at that today. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm delighted to be here with you, and I'll turn it over to our terrific, great Dean, Randy Deal.
Thank you, Bill. Before I make the introduction, and this is partly for Representative Branch's benefit, I just wanted to say that what we have here is one of a series of the Texas Politics Speaker Series that is really one of the wonderful resources for teaching, for research, for public outreach that we have here in the College of Liberal Arts. This is run by Professor Jim Henson. It is part of the Liberal Arts Instructional Technology Services, and it's a very popular venue for our students and some of our faculty to meet with the political leaders of the state of Texas. All of this, of course, will be archived online. I invite you to visit these sites. I know as students in this venue, you do that regularly. But I wanted you to know that you're part of a long, distinguished series of speakers that we've had here representing Texas politics. So I'm delighted to welcome House Member Dan Branch to the College of Liberal Arts. He was elected in 2002 to represent District 108. And as many of you are no doubt aware, he is currently chairman of the House House Committee on Higher Education. I want to thank him for taking time out of his extremely busy schedule. Chairman Branch engages in a wide range of professional interests and public services. He is member of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, a member of the Mayor's Downtown Task Force in Dallas, former chair of the Texas Public Finance Authority appointed by Governor George W. Bush. He is also currently the chairman of SMU's John Towers Center for Political Studies, and he serves on numerous other nonprofit boards. In 2006, he was one of the primary authors of the school finance reform and property tax reduction legislation signed into law by Governor Perry. This session, in addition to chairing the Higher Ed Committee, he is also a member of the Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee, as well as the Legislative Budget Board. He is a graduate of the SMU School of Law and Institute of Comparative and Political and Economic Systems at Georgetown University, and he holds 2 undergraduate degrees from Oklahoma Christian University, graduating summa cum laude in 1980. This session, Chairman Branch is again playing a central role in the decisions that will affect everyone in this room, indeed everyone in the state of Texas. We are eager to hear his thoughts on some of the major issues facing the legislature this session. Please join me in welcoming Chairman Branch to the University of Texas at Austin.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dean, and thank you, President Powers, and Jim, thank you for allowing me to come over and be part of this Texas Politics series, and thank you all for allowing an indistinguished member to join a distinguished series and be a part of this. So it's the old Groucho Marx line about you don't want to be a member of a club that'll allow you to be in. I'm really happy to be here, and as a father of two UT students, I'm particularly fond of the university. Is that how you refer to? Obviously, as a central and sort of the foremost university in the state and the system, part of the system. I know Barry McBee's here from the system. It's obviously, I like to say, so goes Texas, you know, so goes the nation. In many ways, you know, so goes the UT system, so goes Texas. And so it's real important that we get it right in terms of funding and creating the sort of environment here to maintain excellence in the real game in our age, in our era, which is, you know, a knowledge-based economy. And higher ed is certainly one of the critical components of our overall education system. As was mentioned, I've spent a little bit of time focusing on higher education these last few months. I wasn't on the higher ed committee before this term, but I did focus a lot on the funding related to higher education when I served on the budget writing committee in the House for the last 6 years, which we call the Appropriations Committee. And I also spent 6 years on the Public Ed Committee. So to the extent that perhaps is some training to understand some of the challenges facing our K-12 system and pre-K areas, and then try and bring those to bear in the higher ed space. I hope I'm up to the challenge. I think I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on in higher ed. The sort of canvas of talking about the whole legislature is a little bit broad and hard to contain, but I'd like to sort of talk about what I see as the big issues facing higher ed, and then we're certainly free to talk about whatever you all want. Sometimes, for me at least, the most interesting part is hearing you all's questions and sort of reacting to what's on you all's minds. So let me just highlight a little bit where we are in the process. You know, we're over halfway through the session. As you know, your Texas government, anyone here that came from out of state? Or has everyone got a, there you go, it's all right. I had to leave to appreciate and come back and appreciate how, but in Texas we meet every other year, obviously. Odd years, that's when the legislature's in session. When we're not in session, UT just, you know, is in session. And so it's an odd year. It's 2009. We're in session for 140 days by Constitution. We have to leave. We cannot stay longer than the 140 days that the Constitution allows us. And so we have a really hard deadline. It's kind of like finals. And it's going to happen, and we're either going to have written a budget and pass some legislation or not. But the end will come, and we can't extend it. Unlike Washington often has the ability to extend themselves, your federal government, until the 2-year hard deadline when the Congress ends. Our legislative regular session ends, and unless the governor calls us back for a special reason that he determines to be an emergency, we cannot come back into session. So we have a lot of pressure to get our work done. We're over halfway through. We write a 2-year budget because we meet every other year, so we only meet for 140 days every other year unless special session. So here we are. We find ourselves over halfway through the session, and we're, at least in our chamber, bills are starting to come to the floor. They're going through the committee, going through the calendars committee, and then coming onto the floor to be debated and voted on the floor, and then they go over to the other chamber, the House of Lords, or the Supper Club, also affectionately known as the Texas Senate. And those 31 members will then have their chance at legislation. Same way for the Senate, their legislation is coming over to our chamber. And at this point, neither side has sort of heard bills from the other chamber. So you're still working on your own legislation. So that's generally where we are in our chamber. Remember, we're 150 members. We're the one not as close to I-35. Senate closer to 35. We're on the west side. We have 150, a lot more desks, and we have a speaker. They have a lieutenant governor. We have a new speaker in our chamber. Their lieutenant governor's been there a while, David Dewhurst. First session for Joe Strauss from San Antonio. He's a Republican, urban, a little more moderate, conservative. At least that's the perception. He would consider himself to be a fiscal conservative. And he would tell you that he's as surprised as anyone that he's the speaker. And did not plan on being the speaker when the year started just 3 months ago. So that's one of the reasons where I would say the House is a little bit behind in terms of where we were 2 years ago at this time in terms of passing bills or moving bills from committee to calendars to the floor. So that's where we are. Remember, our split of the 150 is 76-74, much closer in terms of partisan breakdown, 76 Republicans, 74 Democrats. And for those of you who are also do math besides liberal arts, that's a close number, and therefore hard to, but for 19 votes in the city of Irving, just to the west of my hometown, Dallas, we would have a 75-75 chamber. We had a recount in the race, the Linda Harper Brown seat in Irving, and she won by 19 votes when the recount was all finished, all said and done. So it's a very close chamber, and therefore, as you'd imagine, sort of harder to get something that would be at a more extreme end of either of the ideological spectrums or political spectrums to get through, because you have a so evenly divided chamber, and a lot of these issues are more rural and urban, rural and or urban, as opposed Republican and Democrat. And so on any given issue, you might lose a few Democrats or pick up a few Republicans on your particular issue, and so you got to watch that and therefore be real careful about when you bring legislation to the floor. You tend to want to know where your numbers are if you can. You can't always control that. It's kind of like the weather in Texas. You can think you're going to go to the floor and have your votes, and then something could have happened the night before. One of the sayings around the Capitol is, you can think someone was dishonest with you, but they may have been honest with you in the morning, but the truth changed over lunch. And so what you take to be a given in the morning in the afternoon can change, because things happen, because people bump into each other, or a bill before your bill on the floor changes the emotional climate and unsettles some members. And so you can't always predict the outcome of these things. There's a certain rhythm that takes place on any given day, again, like the weather. And so part of that you don't see in the textbooks is the group psychology or sociology of a chamber on any given day, and it affects the outcome of these pieces of legislation. The three issues that I think are, let me frame it this way. Higher ed I see as three really large issues. We'll talk about those, and also talk about three bills that kind of relate those. Higher ed, you got to focus on the access and the funding. Excuse me, the access and the affordability and sort of matriculation, the entry point of higher, making sure we're getting enough people in. And we have an overall strategy in this state called Closing the Gaps, where we focus on making sure we're having enough of our population coming into the higher ed system. We have about 1.2 million people such as yourselves in the higher ed system. Remember, this is a state of over 24 million people, 1.2 million, approximately 1.2 to 1.3 million people in higher ed. Over half of those are in the community college system. We have 54 community college systems around the state, hundreds and hundreds of campuses within those. And they are over half, over 50% of the total higher ed population. After that, we have 35 other what we call general academic institutions, but also have obviously graduate, postgraduate work, and that's the slightly less than half of the population of the 1,200,000 students in our higher ed system. So when you look at that and you break down the 35 and all the systems, whether it's the UT system, the A&M system, the UNT system, the Texas Tech system, or the Texas State system are major systems. We have a few independents. That's how we divide up our higher ed. Obviously, we have some fine private institutions. We won't necessarily talk about Baylor and basketball, but we have TCU and SMU and Rice, and so we have other fine, Trinity and San Antonio. We have some really fine private institutions in the state, and they make up about 150,000 students. And remember, coming out of a high school class in Texas, the generic 12th grade that's graduating inside the state, obviously we're bringing in students from out of state, which is a great thing for the mix and the human capital in Texas, but coming out of the sort of collective high school class is about 260,000 students. They're sort of pouring out, we're hoping to get many more of those into the higher ed system. So when I talk about one of the first issues you got to think about in higher ed policy, which is making sure we get more people into the system and get this credential, and more importantly, get the knowledge that makes up the credential so they have these higher learning skills, right? And so we have a knowledgeable workforce that's ready for 21st century life. So that's and so whether that's Texas Grants, our big program that we have now with hundreds of millions of dollars that we're investing in, and we're putting another several $100 million. The budget's not completely finished, but we're making a big push of more funding in it. So whether it's scholarships, loans, grants, or whether it's the price of tuition, that all goes to this issue of can people afford, and are we creating enough incentives to get them into our higher ed system? And that's a very important issue. If you hadn't heard, there's a few people out there thinking that tuition has risen too high, or there's not enough scholarships, or there's not enough scholarships for the middle class. And so it's a big issue. As a father of 3 kids in college, I feel that pain, and so I try to be attentive to that issue. The second issue for me is the funding excellence, making sure we're putting enough resources as the state, as the public governance model, the citizens' vehicle to pour their resources back into their higher ed system, in addition to federal monies and private dollars. So making sure we have enough resources to have an excellent system and maintain our first-tier status for universities like such as the one we're all at today. UT Austin is considered a national research university of the first order. It's a Tier 1 university, and we only have 3 of those in Texas. The other one in College Station, A&M, and Texas A&M, and Rice University, which over the weekend or on Friday announced that they were merging the Baylor College of Medicine, a very fine medical school, private, gets a lot of state funding as a result of an agreement made by Dr. DeBakey and the legislature in 1969. But anyways, Rice is now going to include Baylor College of Medicine, assuming that deal holds together, and that will just make Rice an even more significant Tier 1 university, I guess, because a lot of research dollars flow into that Baylor College of Medicine. So we have 3 of those universities, and it's important that we maintain funding and resources going to those and other universities to maintain excellence. So that's the second pillar, if you will. You got the matriculation, affordability, access, tuition. You got excellence, and finally, the third one for me, at this, and sometimes you could maybe just stop there and you'd say, okay, as long as you keep those 2 in balance, everyone's happy, and we can sort of let the university system, through its boards of regents, through its administrators and leaders like Dr. Powers and your dean, they can figure it out and how to maintain excellence and not only survive but thrive in our economy. For me, there's a pillar that may be unique to this moment, maybe not, but it seems like it's a unique moment, and that is how do you sort of strategically invest in the competitive advantage that the state of Texas has. Why do we have a competitive advantage? We have a strong economy. We have the second largest economy in the U.S., over a $1 trillion. If you compared us as a country, which we're the only state that was, to other countries in the world. We would compare favorably with the nation of Brazil and the nation of Russia, pretty significant countries, and we'd fall somewhere around the 10th, 11th, 12th largest economy in the world. I haven't checked lately because, I mean, a lot of these economies are probably all sinking a little bit. But because we have a strong economy, because we are a large state, we have, in my view, an opportunity to draw talent, whether those are really smart faculty members, really smart people, and their laboratories and their assistants and their research dollars that are interested in their higher thinking skills and their abilities to innovate, along with really smart students who such as yourselves, who have identified themselves through various tests and metrics and ways we find out people are really capable and high achievers, and bring those to the state at a time when other states, I like to compare Texas to 4 other states, what I call the Big Five. I started thinking this way from a chance meeting I had when President Bush was governor, and I made some comment about being in Tennessee, and the Tennessee governor didn't seem to have as many bodyguards as the Texas governor. And that elicited a response that, Branch, you need to understand that there are big states and there are small states. And the governor was right. You may disagree with him on things, but on this point, I think he was right. If you look at the large economies, those 5 states make up 40% of the gross domestic product of the nation. California, the largest, Texas, New York, now 3rd, used to be 2nd, Florida, Illinois, passed up Pennsylvania several years ago. So those 5 economies are large. What do we know about those 5 economies today? Texas is the only one that's not in deficit mode. And if you look at the largest, California and New York, they're in significant deficit mode. Some would say economic free fall. And so we have a real opportunity to go to places like fine institutions in California, who has one of the great higher ed systems, a state that has 9 Tier 1 universities, a state like New York that has 7 Tier 1 universities, and states like Massachusetts, Illinois, Florida. We can go there and attract talented faculty members and talented students who may be interested in coming here anyway, and therefore at a discount bring them to Texas because they're already inclined to leave. In California, the governor's nickname is the Terminator, and it's happening. I mean, he's having to terminate a lot of higher ed employees along with a lot of other state employees just because of the state of their economy. So today we may have one of President Power's former colleagues at Berkeley who's sitting there not feeling so good about his budget, his assistants who've been let go, his lab, his federal research dollars, and the grant writing, and whether or not, and so he may be thinking, you know what, Austin might be a more interesting place for my team to reside. And so we have an opportunity to go bring those sorts of folks and the circle of capital, human and financial, with them to a place like Austin or a place like College Station or a place in Houston, small town up north named Dallas. And so to me, that's the strategic moment that Texas has. And the question is, in a tough economy where we're all trying to balance and make sure our spending matches our revenues, and we've got falling sales tax and falling revenues, do we dip into a rainy day fund? Do we dip into stimulus monies? Do we look for ways to perhaps set aside some monies to make a strategic investment to bring this capital to us that may already be inclined to come here because of the current situation, and bring it to us at a discount because of relative to where they are and where we are, they may be more inclined than in a strong economy in California to come to Texas. So to me, that's something that we don't want to be penny wise and dollar foolish. We also don't want to be penny wise and dollar foolish and miss an opportunity to build the facilities that we need at a time when interest rates are at really historic low moments, or we can leverage off federal dollars that are coming in for one purpose, and then we can use state dollars for another. So we may have a really interesting strategic moment and a competitive advantage to take care of business and make some investments in where we need to be in higher ed. So those three things. What are the bills that drive that? We've got legislation called our Emerging Tier 1s. This is a piece of legislation that is passed out of my committee last week, and basically creates a grand competition for 7 universities that have been identified by the Higher Education Coordinating Board that are emerging to the status of where your university is at some point, and that we put some resources out there and put some metrics in place to incentivize them striving for greatness. And I think it'll have broad support. The devil's in the details, as always, in figuring out what the metrics are and how those metrics might advantage a Texas Tech over a University of Houston or a UT Dallas or UT San Antonio, UTEP, and University of North Texas. I think those are the 7 in the emerging Tier 1 status. So that's House Bill 51 in our chamber, and the Senate has a couple of bills. So Senator Duncan, Senator Zaffarini, Chairman Zaffarini are also looking at this issue, and we'll have some slightly different takes on it. But I think I certainly hope the legislature can move in this direction and create an opportunity to provide for more first-tier universities, which I think is taking advantage of a strategic moment. We also have a bill that focuses on a little rule in the high school admissions area called the Top 10% Rule. Anyone heard of it? We're trying to, last time I checked, I think it's a really high priority of the UT system and University of Texas at Austin, and your president probably has to spend a disproportionate amount of his time thinking about it. And so our hope is that we can take that rock out of his sack that he has to carry around once June shows up around here. So here's the issue. 10% rule, any high school, public or private, that ranks their graduates, they automatically have a right to get into any of the 35 higher eds I talked about, and a lot of them are disproportionately choosing, guess, right? They want to come to the university, and so we're getting a really disproportionate amount of the entering class of about 7,200 that are coming in this way, and therefore we're having trouble filling out a lot of the colleges and different departments and schools that need certain types of folks who are really brilliant at music or math or science, and the people that just come in and may all want to be, part of Dean Dill's program. And so at some point, it's creating an imbalance within the system, and really at some point going to choke off the ability to recruit a broad range of talented folks. It's kind of like saying, hey, we want really broad, talented folks, but at the end of the day, the only metric that matters is how you finished in your class. And if you were, if you have a class of, if you're in the top 10% as opposed to the 11%, then all the other elements of what defines character or high achieving folks that we want to be a part of the universities, whatever it is, those issues aren't as important. So for many reasons, we're trying to fix this. It's a lot harder than you think. We did get the bill passed with some limitations on it in the Senate, was that last week, after a pretty vigorous debate. And so now the heavy lifting moves to our chamber, the one not as close to I-35. So if you stay tuned for, at some point we'll have an interesting time in the House, and hopefully we'll prevail, and hopefully we'll get a broad consensus. And so that's literally where we are today, is building the numbers and making the case to members who had some concerns or voted against the issue 2 years ago. So that's another really important piece of legislation that ultimately not only will affect UT Austin, but it's about to start affecting schools like Texas A&M and University of Texas at Dallas, as those schools start surging toward 50% of their incoming class coming from the top 10% cohort in the state. The other bill I'll say is there's a series of bills, and it's the tuition. It's that first pillar I talked about. And so do we go back and, so here's the question. We now have a deregulated system. What does that mean? It means that boards of regents of universities decide and set tuition, along with input from their administrative leaders and students, and obviously they have to recognize the market and what parents' concerns are, and financial aid funding and ability, and so all that comes into play, and they got to make sure they manage their business model and make sure that they're got sound economies that aren't losing money. So that's the model we're under right now. And in order to, and the question is, because tuitions have risen in the last several years since the legislature went to this model, which was in 2003, some people want to go back and say, hey, we need to go back and have the legislature re-regulate or regulate tuition. And then there's various hybrids in between. There's some sort of, putting some freezes and some temporary regulation or temporary stops or inflation caps that somehow have at least some limited regulatory effect on the tuition price over and above the boards of regents making that decision. So there's a series of those bills. None of those have passed in the Senate yet, and they haven't been heard in the House chamber, so that we haven't brought them out in our committee yet. So we're moving those forward, and there's a lot of them, and we're trying to sort of consolidate which ones we're going to actually focus on, and where members are on trying to check the pulse of various members as to how where they are on the spectrum of sort of re-regulation to maintaining the status quo and deregulation. So those are sort of the three largest issues and the three biggest bills sort of facing the Texas legislature halfway through the session in the 81st meeting of your legislature in 2009, and how the answer, how those bills will play out. If anyone thinks they know the answer, then don't believe them. I would say if you're betting family money, there's a good chance we'll pass the emerging technology, the emerging Tier 1 university bill, and then the question will be what method of financing and how much financing will be put behind it. On the second issue, we've passed one chamber on the top 10% reform bill. I wouldn't want to prognosticate in here because it might get out, and I wouldn't want to seem overly optimistic or unnecessarily pessimistic, but I think our chances are good that we're going to get some consensus and reform the top 10% rule. And for those who like it and want to keep it, they'll be able to say it's still in place. And for those who don't like it and want to see it be diminished in the role it plays in college entrance classes, hopefully we'll see some improvement there. So both sides can take home a victory, if you will. And then I have no idea how the tuition legislation is going to play out. I mean, my crystal ball is not that good. I think we have people all over the place, but my sense is that there'll be a push for something, and that some members will feel like that will become very important to them late in the session, that they will realize that maybe something is not happening, and then there'll be a push, and so we'll see how that one plays out. So I would say there's probably a decent chance of some sort of change that happens in the tuition rule. Part of that's already happening in the budget, and that we're putting significant amounts of new dollars into the Texas grants programs and some of the other scholarship programs. So that hopefully will relieve some of the pressure on the tuition side. And I think that's probably a good place to take a pause and get some input from you all onto how you see things from your perspective.
That doesn't really, it has to do with your committee, has to do with your committee, but you haven't really talked about it. I know that UNT is proposing to put a law school in downtown Dallas, and you being a native of Dallas, and I'm a native of Dallas, and I know that downtown Dallas needs a lot of revitalization. In my short 21 years, I've seen it good and bad and good and bad. So I was wondering what you thought about UNT potentially putting a law school in downtown Dallas. If that'd be good for Dallas, and then how would that affect the schools in UT, like UT Law and things like that.
All right, so you and I haven't met before, right? No. And you're not a plant. No. That question's not a plant. Absolutely, I authored the bill, and thank you for mentioning that. I was not going to bother a UT class with such a provincial notion as having another law school that wouldn't nearly stand up to the standards of Towns Hall. But I appreciate you bringing it up. I'm the author of the bill. It has moved out of our committee. Surprisingly, we got a hearing and were able to vote it out fairly quickly. The hard part, of course, is it has a fiscal note. Everyone get that? When you have a piece of legislation that costs money, there's sort of a discipline or a tradition in the House to wait till the budget passes so we don't get out ahead of ourselves. So it's sort of going to be sitting in calendars. Hopefully we'll get that passed. And not just because it's good for downtown Dallas, which it will be. I mean, I see that as a serendipity. I don't think you should just higher ed policy shouldn't be driven by economic development because it always can be. And if the truth be told, it sometimes is, maybe often is, but hopefully not, sometimes is. I mean, sometimes members want to have a institution in their area and they will it to happen, and it ultimately does some good, but someone else on a coordinating board might say, well, we didn't really need one there, and so that's always a struggle. But the reason I ultimately carried the legislation, even though I'm an SMU law grad, and I had some SMU folks who weren't so they weren't so keen on it, and the reason ultimately I got convinced that one, I represent downtown Dallas, so being honest, that had some it got my attention. And two, really the most important issue is if you look in our large metroplex, we're 1/3 of the economy of the state in Dallas-Fort Worth, 6.5 million people, really important region in our state and the country, 12th largest metroplex in the world. We're the only one that doesn't have a public law school. And in a democracy, rule of law society, if you're going to be at 6.5 million people and you're going to projected to double within a few years, a decade or more, this thing could get really big fast, and it may be important to have a public law school so people can learn the rules without having to leave. We're the largest consumer of legal services in the state, and so places like, well, I mean, the nearest public law school would be a few blocks from here, and so. Anyways, ultimately, I think if you look down the road, and fine law schools, it takes them 20, 30 years to build up. So if you look down the road 30 years, I think you can make a really good case for a law school in the Metroplex. And so I choose to look down the road a long ways and start the process now. And it's a pretty small investment on a relative basis to other graduate programs. But thanks for asking. Yes, sir.
Representative, regarding the top 10%, of the two chambers of the legislature, it was the House that didn't pass the reforms last session. And I was wondering how we would build a broad consensus for reforms, especially considering that in the Senate at least, there were some legislators who changed their votes from last time around supporting the reforms to not supporting them this time. So.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. You got to watch that, and you got to go check in because facts change and members change. In our chamber, a lot of members change, so you may not have the same. I think we have 17 or 18 new members, and so you got to manage all that process. So the question is, why do I think we might be able to pass it in the House? Well, I'm an optimist, and it needs to happen, and I think we've got sort of the noble cause is on our side, and so I'm hoping that we can prevail. But let me just go back to your question. You said that we didn't pass it last time, and you're right. We did pass it on second reading, and then when it went to the conference committee, and then it came back from the conference committee on a pretty tough weekend. Remember I was talking earlier on about I talked to some some UT Dallas scholars earlier this morning, but I think I talked about the weather and the turbulence you can have. And so we had one of those tough nights where the bill came up and it was really turbulent, and people were upset about some other issues, and there was this group trying to take the speaker out, which is pretty, even for the Texas legislature, that gets a little rough. And so in the context of all that, we had this bill come out, and that sort of causes, the elbows to fly, and people, there were people working to flip votes on the bill just because they were mad about something else. And so I would also point to you as a reason for optimism that the House did pass it in 2005, and the Senate was unable to pass it. And then the year before, we had the votes in the House, and the Senate ultimately was filibustered in 2003. So, until last year, a lot of people thought we had a better shot in the House. Now, as I was mentioning, the numbers 76, 74, I mean, the sort of right of center majorities that might have been more inclined to pass this have changed, and so we have a much more, we have a much closer split in terms of political parties. This issue doesn't necessarily follow political parties, but it just means I think we've got more work to do, and therefore people would probably say, particularly since it's now passed in the Senate, that the House is the more difficult chamber to get passed in. So we'll see. We'll do our homework. We'll count heads. We'll see where the difficulties are. We'll make some compromises where we have to. I was talking to members about this on the floor. So I get a lot of people come up to me and they say, "Hey, can I have my bill heard?" And I, just to be completely honest with you, I say, I listen to their issue, and then I say, "Hey, on a completely separate matter, what do you think about the top 10% reform?" And so anyway, there's this sort of grand discussion and dialogue that goes along about all these bills, and at some point you got to be careful about trading too hard, and a lot of times you can't just do direct trades. What you can do is hopefully create an opening, create an opportunity, see where their concerns are, see if they have a misperception, and work to try and change that. And ultimately, I think it was Aristotle taught us about all this stuff. Persuasive speech, rhetoric. I mean, you got to have good logos. You got to have your facts. You have to have some emotion, and your audience has to. You got to know the emotion of your audience, and have some pathos. And then ultimately, the speaker has to have some ethos, and has to have credibility and trust with a member. And so if a member wants to help in another area but is happy to help us in say the top 10% area, then you got to make sure that you can be perceived as trustworthy, and that you're credible to speak on an issue, and that you know the facts, and that ultimately when you say we're going to make a compromise, or you say you're going to get someone on the conference committee, or urge the speaker to put them on the conference committee, or if you say that you're going to help them in another area of legislation, then you better follow through with it, because that goes to your ability to persuade someone to come over to your position. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for coming. I just wanted to ask you really quick. Obviously, there's a lot of different elements to the whole question of, tuition rates, affordability, recapping it, leaving it deregulated. But how do you feel that whole debate should affect students' ability to vote to raise their own fees for particular things? And in particular, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the bill that's before your committee, 3353, for environmental service fees, to give students the ability to vote to have fees for environmental improvements on their own campus.
Yeah, we haven't heard that one yet, but we have a lot of these student fee bills, and it's interesting. A member will come up and say, "Hey, I want to." I think it was Representative Coleman has a bill for one of the schools in the Houston area. I think it's Texas Southern. Could be perhaps, or maybe it's University of Houston. But he came to me recently and said, "Hey, I want to get my bill set for a hearing." Sure, Garnet, on a separate matter. How are you? And then we talked about the substance, and it was like, oh, everyone's you're upset about tuition, but you're going to bring a bill that's raising fees. And he sort of shrugged and smiled and said, well, hey, the students voted for it. So we have several of those. I know UTEP had one of those come up. University of Texas El Paso had one of those situations, and so. I guess ultimately we hear. I mean, I think it's they often pass because the students voted for it. Seems like I remember one for Texas State University.
Yeah, they have that kind of environmental service fee there.
Yeah, and so it's powerful when you go out before a legislative body and say the students. Of course the issue is, well, this student, this particular student body at this time voted for this increase, but they're going to bind future ones, but. It's a powerful message to say that the students voted this on themselves, and so then everyone else is starting to play defense a little bit.
I wanted to ask you a question about the top 10% bill.
Yeah.
You said it was passed in the Senate. Is that talking about Shapiro's bill, or was that?
Yes.
Okay. In regards.
Senate Bill 175, as I recall.
175. Okay. I just have a quick question regarding. Do you think it will disproportionately represent rural or inner city urban schools who often don't have enough funding to provide AP classes or prestigious electives or some of those things that might be used in the criteria that wouldn't be used in the top 10%?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It goes to we have a large state with a lot, 1,200, if you include free enrollment charter schools, 1,200 school districts. I can't remember, so like 8,000 campuses. I mean, we have, and we're all over, very rural areas, incredibly dense, urban, tough neighborhoods, and so we're all over. And therefore, you got to say, well, how does this play out, and where are the equities? Which I think is sort of your issue. And so some places have more AP and pre-AP courses, and therefore, with some students in high school, I'm starting to learn. Everyone figures out you can get these courses, and you can get even if you make a B, you still get a 4, and if you make an A, you get a 5, and of course, everybody tells where the easiest place to make a 5 is, and so those courses fill up, and so obviously, if you're at a high school that doesn't have that many, well, then you got to make sure you maintain your GPA, and so there's a lot of debate over there about. I think the whole uniform GPA issue is in the high school accountability bill, or excuse me, the K-12 accountability bill, House Bill 3, which is in the Public Ed Committee. Chairman Eisler and Chairman Shapiro in the Senate will be, so that issue is out there, and I think your question, it really cuts both ways. Some people will say, well, it's easier to, and we have anecdotal stories of people actually moving, families moving to a high school where they think their child can be positioned better in the top 10%, and then those high schools have different rules, or those districts have different rules on whether or not you carry your GPA with you or you start afresh, depending on what they think is fair or not. And so, I think there's plenty of opportunity to say, well, a particular high school, it's quote, easier to have a high GPA, whether you're in a rural area and someone in a rural area. So, well, it's easier in the urban or suburban setting where there's more AP classes. So I think both sides can have this argument about, fairness. And the answer is to get all high schools up to a really high level and have a sort of relatively equal level of rigor, and obviously have more AP courses, more selections at more high schools. And then we're working on that in the K-12 area, trying to put more resources out.
Right. And then also, and this on the same topic, are a large number of minorities in the top 10%, or is that?
Well,
I mean, how would it affect diversity by capping
yeah,
it?
no. I mean, in a little bit of history here. There was a Hopwood decision, Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, New Orleans, and this decision in the middle '90s drove this reaction, because that decision, not by the U.S. Supreme Court but by the Fifth Circuit, said that you can't take You can't take race into consideration, race or ethnicity into consideration. So the Texas legislature, when it came back in, said, okay, well, we'll wire around that is, we'll ultimately have Senator Barrientos, then Senator Barrientos, Representative Rangel, former higher ed chair, said, okay, well, we'll sort of wire around that is to have this top 10% rule, and then, so obviously communities of African Americans, communities where it's predominantly Hispanic, their class will get in, and so it was a way to sort of have a merit-based metric, if you will, but resolve the some of the diversity challenges that we're facing in the state. So fast forward, you ultimately have a U.S. Supreme Court, a couple of involving the University of Michigan, a couple of cases involving the University of Michigan that are decided where you can take race or ethnicity into a panoply of elements in the admissions process. And so, some people argue, therefore, we ought to get rid of it completely because its raison d'etre, its reason for being, no longer exists. And so, let's just let the admissions committee at the University of Texas at Austin, given that's the school that's most being affected by it, let them make the decision. And you've got a president who's got a great track record at the UT Law School. Of having more diversity, dramatically more diversity, so let's rock and roll and get rid of the rule. It's just not that easy because different issues arise. I mean, certain communities come to rely on it. Certain members have invested their authorship and they've staked their reputations and their rhetoric back in their districts on, you can't be excluded, and this is a real important rule. So to go home and say, well, we don't need it anymore, is pretty dramatic change. And so these things need to evolve, and I think we're trying to have this thing evolve. One of the things that we didn't realize was that over time, the rural areas have come to, at least perception is built up. Some of us would say it's a misperception that this is better for rural Texas. And so now you've got rural members joining so-called minority members, some of who are now about to be in the majority. But and so you get coalitions that weren't even anticipated, and you got rural Republicans that think the rule is fabulous because they have either a fair perception or a misperception that their students are getting in, and weren't doing so well before the rule. But then you got to bring in this, that perception is really important. Everyone know the first rule of politics? Perception is reality. And so you got to manage perceptions. You got to manage the policy and argue the policy and the facts, but you've also got to manage perception, and that ultimately that's more important in our business because that's what drives opinion. That's what drives voters. That's what drives the electoral process ultimately. And so it's real important to manage the perception in addition to the policy. So you could make a great case on the policy, but if you fail to change perception, a member may say, yeah, that's great, it makes a good case, but the people back home don't believe that. So I'm voting with the people back home. Show me a 2 on your bill. And so you got to help them change what you perceive as a misperception to help them, to give them the freedom to vote with you, changing the perception.
I'd like to get your opinion and maybe insight into the Recovery Act. I've been watching, the transparency of the website, and I'm very interested in local, state, and federal grants. And it's been really interesting to watch them come out of the federal government through NEH and through Department of Education and through National Science Foundation in sort of the traditional ways that they come down to higher education. But then there's this pot of money that's been given to the governor's office, and there's 18.2% that's supposed to be earmarked for higher education. So is your committee involved with that, and do you have any insight about how that's going to be dispersed?
Yes and no. The committee that gets the first shot at that is the Appropriations Committee. I keep someone assigned to watch that committee as someone who used to get up early and go to bed late every day on appropriations. In one sense, I miss it. This is my first session not being on appropriations. And so I kind of, I've been dizzy because that's kind of was my anchor for what I did down here. So I watch it, and we've been paying close attention to it. But that's where, you know, the Article 3 of the budget, the education part of the budget, the largest piece of your state budget, K-12 being the larger portion of that. So they're Article 3, chaired by Scott Hochberg, my friend from Houston, has had the first crack at that. That now has gone to the full committee and will be voted out next week in the House. The Senate just voted theirs out. And so at some point there'll be a conference committee on your Article 3, the education, and they'll wrestle through that. And they're also waiting on some deadlines for some rules. Outside deadline of May 15th, which is going to be, could be problematic. We're hoping that the Education Department will promulgate some rules quicker. We've had a couple of visits by our Commissioner of Education to try and figure out what the exact intent was. In the higher ed space, it's a little even more unclear as to how we spend that, and we don't have some of the deficits that are anticipated in other states, and the legislation is forcing, calling for states to, their first priority, to supplant the loss of state dollars. We may or may not have that issue, and then the question is, then can we go to some other priorities once we fill holes or don't fill holes, and depending on whether or not we view it that way, then it determines how we can spend money down the chain. You made the comment about the governor. I mean, there's one view that if we were to not finish or have to go into special session, there could be an opportunity for the governor to spend the money, have the power to spend the money without consulting the legislature, which could change, which adds a dynamic to the floor. So if you're someone that's maybe not too keen on the budget and you want to vote against it in order to force the issue and force a special session, you may think twice, because now you may not have liked the way your colleagues are spending it, but you really may not like, or you might, depending on your view of how the governor would spend the money. So that's a dynamic that will affect the budget debate, and it already is. Ultimately, you know, we're looking at about somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion, $3 to $4 billion in the education area, and most of that is being directed to K-12, but that's going to free up some other dollars in the higher ed space. And there's rules like you can't apply those funds to new buildings. You can use it to remodel existing. So there's a lot of sort of federal limitations on how to use the money, and a series of priorities that you have to go through, and we're working through those. The bottom line is much more is going to K-12 than to higher ed, but it's freeing up other dollars that we can put into higher ed. So we're working through the process.
Chairman Branch, thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you.